Hello, my name is Claire Gebben. I'm the author of The Last of the Blacksmiths, a historical novel, and the memoir, How We Survive Here, Families Across Time. I'm excited to be an Ohioana author. I thank the Ohioana organizers for inviting me here. My books are both set in Ohio, which makes me an Ohio author. However, and also I grew up there. But I am actually talking to you from my lower level at my house on Mercer Island, Washington, which is a suburb of Seattle. And I'm delighted to be here to talk to you today about ways to think about telling your own stories and telling your family stories that will make them last and be important to your family now and your family for generations. So I'm going to share my screen for you now. Thank you for bearing with me during that pause. Okay, I'm going to move my little picture here down into this corner. I'll keep chatting with you. The whole reason that my books got published were due to the discovery of family letters and the amazing stories that brought into existence. This is my historical novel that was published in 2014, and then I followed that up because it was based on letters. I followed that up with a nonfiction book that tells the story behind the story of writing this novel. I wrote it really to help inspire people to consider writing their own family stories, and also to share the letters that were discovered. They're all translated and included here. They were translated by my German relative, Angela Weber. And they have a lot of surnames of Ohio German immigrants. And so I wanted to make those available to the public. Today, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of my story, and then I'm going to go into some storytelling considerations for when you are writing your own work, and talk about a few format choices, and conclude with why storytelling matters. So, probably the reason I am a storyteller in my family is my grandmother, Emma Patterson. She lived in a house on the same driveway as my house. So I would often stop by on the way home from school, or my mother would send me up with a piece of pie or something. And grandmother, I would knock on the door, and I would hear grandmother first. I would hear her heavy shoes come clumping in to open the door for me. Her shoes were some of those old grandmother style shoes. And I could often, even before the door was open, smell what she was cooking, especially if she was cooking pork chops and onions, a dish she taught me how to make that she learned from her German ancestors. It smells very oniony and rich and delicious. And then she had a formica table in her kitchen. Perhaps you remember this from the era, with the chrome and the high polish, and you could put your hands on the tabletop and trace the little squares that were in the formica with your finger. And we would sit at the table, and she would tell me stories. Sometimes in the summer, she would even produce the magical root beer float. I don't know if you remember the root beer float, but it's sweet and frothy, and when the ice cream goes into the root beer, there's foam that bubbles up. Anyway, I have very fond memories of my grandmother, and one of the main stories that she repeated to me often was the story of her favorite grandfather. My grandmother grew up in a bilingual household. She lived, this is my grandmother here at about age 15, and this is her mother, and in their home, in her father, in their home lived her grandmother, Elizabeth Crawley, and her grandfather, Michael Harm. And Michael Harm was a German immigrant. He came at the age of 15 in 1857, and he married Elizabeth Crawley, whose parents were German immigrants. They came closer to the 1840s. So they spoke German to each other, and my grandmother could understand German quite well. She would tell me the story of how her grandfather left his town of Freinsheim, Germany, in 1857 at age 15. He was a farmer's son. Only Michael Harm hated farm work, and the story went that he followed a music band and got on a passenger ship, a sailing ship that traveled for 43 days across the Atlantic Ocean, and he came to Cleveland, Ohio, and apprenticed as a blacksmith. Later on, as he grew older, he worked himself up to be able to be the co-owner of a carriage works, which is the predecessor of today's car manufacturer. So I heard that story quite often, and grandmother would tell me about how in the window of the carriage manufacturer, she would sit up there and watch the parades go by on Woodland Avenue in Cleveland in her generation, which were the 1890s to the and following. So Michael Harm came alone, and what that meant was he left behind his brother and his father and his mother. This is his brother Philip Harm, who lived in Freinsheim, Germany. And the two brothers corresponded until their deaths. And then the wives and daughters and granddaughters began to correspond with one another. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details, but fast forward to 2008, when Angela Weber comes to visit me at my home. Angela Weber, just like I'm the granddaughter of my grandmother here, and grew up in Cleveland, Angela Weber is the granddaughter of Helena Weber, and Angela grew up in Freinsheim, Germany. And because of that enduring correspondence between the relatives, Angela and I knew one another as well. And Angela came to visit me in Seattle, and when she came, she brought with her a surprise. She brought letters that were found in an attic in Germany that were written by our common ancestors between the years 1841 and 1900. And they tell a very unique story of German immigrants to Cleveland and what their experience was just before the Civil War, during the artisan craft era, and how everything transformed into the machine age, and life shifted in very dramatic ways during their lifetimes. So, why did I tell this story? Well, for one thing, I cared about the story because my grandmother told it to me so often, and it mattered to her. And it has been proven that telling stories about what you care about means others are inspired to care too. And I want to encourage you to think about the stories that are important in your lives and stories that you care about and ways that you can communicate those to your family. Also, don't just tell them the stories, write the stories down. You know, you think that you're boring people, you think that they're going to remember everything. They may even tell you, I've heard it a million times, but just write it down, because after a while they sort of develop a deafness and stop listening, and it becomes really important later. Write it down, you may say? Well, I have heard many excuses. Here's my dad's version of writing it down. He just jotted down the historical notes of things he'd heard from his grandmother, from his mother, and other things that he researched and discovered. Here's the story grandmother told, and dad too. Michael Harm hated work in fields, went to village music, followed the music band. That's a reference to 16-year-old blacksmith. Now, sometimes you might have a different version of the story. Dad says 16-year-old blacksmith because in my research, I later found out that Michael Harm's birthday happened on the boat. So he was 15 when he left Germany and he was 16 when he arrived. So here are some excuses that you may tell yourself. I haven't finished researching. What if I get it wrong? I can't use a computer. I can't type. I can't write. I don't have the time. I'm going to go into all of these as we go through this talk. My sister, brother, aunt, cousin, twice removed, doesn't remember it that way. I've heard that quite a bit. Don't worry about it. Just get the story out. And you can even start simply, because not only do we have important stories in our history, we have important objects that mean something to us. So one of the ways that my own family kept me abreast of what it was that was important to them was they labeled things. Here, my grandmother labeled that these were her grandmother's glasses. She also labeled the photographs in her photo album, all very helpful. She made an inventory of the items that are in the house, and there was a table that she had in her possession, and she tells a little story about it. The little table given to us by Mrs. Shireman belonged to Michael Harm's grandmother, Mrs. Hondra. Therefore, it belonged to Clyde Patterson's great-great-great-grandmother and must be 150 years old. These handwricks are buried in Erie Street Cemetery. She wrote it down. I would never have known those things if she hadn't. So, when you think about the ways that you're going to write it down, don't worry too much about the format. You can do it in so many different ways. You can do little vignettes where you just zero in on some key moments in your life. I am part of a genealogy writing group, and we are all writing from such different angles. Some of us have written based on letters. Others have written based on the recipes in a recipe box and told stories about her mom via those recipes that she's uncovered. Other people write about artifacts, an old clock or an old beer stein. By the way, this is Michael Harm's beer stein. And it might seem improbable that I would know that, and it would be improbable that I could guess it was, but actually inside of this beer stein is another one of my grandmother's slips of paper saying that this is Michael Harm's beer stein. So labeling the back of pictures on the wall, labeling artifacts that are important, it all is very helpful to those of us who follow. When you're writing, it's also really important to know who you're writing it for. You could write for immediate family. I have written a narrative of the story of my mother's life. She developed Alzheimer's when her oldest grandchild was 9 and her youngest grandchild was just born. And her grandchildren really didn't know her. And so I've written a life narrative that talks about who she was as a person, and I wrote that for immediate family. When you write for immediate family, it's important not to talk about things that may be embarrassing for someone who's still living, and so you have to be a little careful about your choice of words, but that doesn't mean you should shy away from key moments in your life. Maybe you're writing for friends at the holidays, which has a whole different audience and voice. So if you're writing for generations who follow, you want to think about how times change. So people used to travel by train all the time, not by car. Long distance phone calls used to be expensive. Now they're not on a cell phone. So people might wonder, why didn't they just pick up the phone and call? Why did they write letters? Well, you can explain that long distance was expensive, and that gives some context to the generations in the future. Not to mention how the computers have changed from floppy disks to CD-ROMs to clouds. So if you're writing for genealogical scholars or historians, something that might be put in a genealogy library, that has its whole specific format, and there's books you can get about that that will be helpful to you. Oh, you can't see this because my little box is here, but this is broader reading public. Now, I added that in because maybe your ancestor was in a circus, or there's some sort of more exciting story to be told about them. If you're writing for the broader reading public, I chose actually to fictionalize my novel because the story about Michael Harm would have been a kind of myopic story just if I had him in the book. So I created other characters, true to life, that probably were around him, but I don't know for sure. I created conversations and feelings that I wouldn't know for sure, just to universalize the story, because my ancestor, as it turned out, Michael Harm, was one of 1 million German immigrants that came to the US between 1850 and 1860. So he was part of a broader story that I wanted to tell in my novel, The Last of the Blacksmiths. So when you're getting started, don't worry too much about formats, don't worry too much about wording, just jot down your thought without filters. I can't stress enough, the way I became a writer was I had a teacher who told me, don't worry about it, just get the story out. And that really is the way to get it started. So each of us, when we're sitting down without filters, ready to write, our past experience or the stories we heard, I picture it like a very deep lake. This is an image I've created out of Crater Lake, but that is a very, very deep lake with so much to draw from. And it's hard to know then where to get started. And so one image to help you with that is to think about just skipping stones across the surface of the lake. That's your draft. There may be places you want to go back and go deeper on, but just skip the stones to get started. What you want to touch on. This isn't very visible here. A first draft is like skipping stones, but don't necessarily think, like if you're going to write about your life, you don't have to start at the beginning. You can start wherever you want to start. You can start with the best story. You can start with a story you most want to tell. You can start with a funny story. My Aunt Elizabeth likes to start with funny stories. That is really important, because if you start at the beginning, you may never get around to the story you really wanted to tell. One of the formats that I found really helpful came out of a poem by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe that was called Primal Words, Orphic. And it has 5 stanzas, and each stanza introduces a certain phase in a person's life to think about. And by the way, if you want a handout for this, you can email me at clairegebben@gmail.com, and I will send you a handout with links and specifics to the things that I'm talking about here. In the first stanza, it's about destiny, where you were born, things that you had no control over that you were given starting in life. The second is chance. That's when things happen. Maybe there was a depression. Maybe there was a virus outbreak. Things that you had no control over, but that shifted or were formative experiences for your life. Love. Who you met and married, whether you decided to remain single because you loved your job, whether you had a family, whether you didn't have a family, all of the things that really settle you into your adult life patterns would be the next paragraph. Then there's many, many years where you just live out of necessity. You're making the paycheck, you've got your degree, you found your job, whatever, and those are the years of necessity. But there's a final part in the stanzas, and that final part is hope. And I think that's also important to include in our life stories, is what we hope for, what we wish for, what we find most important, and hope will continue. So now I'm going to talk about a few storytelling considerations. One thing that really makes a story three-dimensional is to include all five senses, not just the visual senses. Sight. When I was talking about my grandmother's life story, stories that she'd tell me, I would talk about what her house looked like and how she was on the driveway. I talked about the sound of her, and I showed you a picture of her. I talked about the sound of her heavy grandmother shoes. I talked about the touch of the Formica tabletop. I talked about the aroma of the pork chops and onions and the taste of the root beer floats. So that gives it a more well-rounded image that you can relate to and that people will be drawn in by. I also want to encourage you to think about what I call a sixth sense. I know some call it a sixth sense ESP, but I'm talking about feeling, emotion. How did it feel? And I want to just propose that you reflect on this quote by Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Other storytelling considerations are, it's nice to include the conflict. We want to be honest in these stories. We don't just want to make them all rosy, peachy keen. And if you don't tell the hard stuff, the difficult times you had, people are less able to learn from the experiences you had and think about their own lives in those terms. But conflict can come in many different forms. It could be self versus self, self versus others. It could be struggles you had in your community. It could be struggles you had against nature. Oof, that's a scary tornado there. It could be struggles that you had in the workplace, sort of on the hamster wheel, or with technology and Facebook scrolling addiction, doom scrolling, whatever. It could be struggles you had in finding your faith and figuring out your beliefs and what life is all about. So there's many different conflicts that you can introduce into your stories, both your family stories about your parents or your grandparents, but also about yourself, that will be helpful to your readers in the future. And in your resolution, please do not forget to include things you hope for. What makes life hopeful to you? As for format choices, a biographical sketch would be a nice brief way to go about it, maybe even 5 paragraphs that follow those 5 categories that Goethe had in his poem, Destiny, Chance, Love, Necessity, Hope. If you wrote 5 paragraphs with a theme for each of those, you would have your life story written up in a pretty little picture. Narrative genealogy, then you would draw more, if you're a genealogist type, from the different documents that you find, marriage certificates, death certificates, census records, and that kind of thing, and put together the story of a family's life or ancestral chart of some kind. I think it's really important to write down or record the oral history, both of your really living relatives or the stories you remember your relatives telling you in the past. And as I said before, the sky's the limit in terms of how you're going to do it. You could do it based on describing an object, or you could do it based on describing a photo. Family history album. This is something a friend of mine, Dave Williams, does. He researches his ancestry. He writes a family history album that includes text and pictures, and then he publishes it on something called HP MagCloud. Again, if you want to email me at clairegebben@gmail.com, I can send you the link to that site. And he creates a document that can both be printed out and also made as a PDF that family members can look at online at a very affordable cost. So that's a consideration too. You can make an audio or video recording. My brother took my dad on to old sites of the family and had my dad talk in the video about those sites. You could make an audio recording, especially if you have trouble typing or can't use a computer or so on. With a cell phone these days, it becomes much more available. Now, for just a moment, I'm going to talk about the difference between memoir and autobiography, because that's become a bit a source of some confusion in the writing world about our lives today. So, an autobiography is going to cover the story of your life from birth to present. And it's going to include pretty much everything, all the details. But more common these days, people are writing memoirs where they're just zeroing in on the life-changing moment in their lives and just telling that story. And so a memoir does not start at the beginning, generally. And maybe at some point in the memoir, you might want to fill in, I was born in Punxsutawney or whatever. But you don't have to. It's basically both what happened, how you coped with it, and how you think about it today is sort of the format of a memoir in general. Now, memoirs, examples of those are Wild, the story of the time that Cheryl Strayed hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. Back a little earlier, a memoir is Out of Africa, that Isaac Dennison wrote about her time in Africa. Another one was Henry David Thoreau. He wrote a memoir about his year on Walden Pond. And some say that the first memoir ever written is The Confessions of St. Augustine. So if you want to get historic and read that would be one of the first memoirs ever written. Now, as for my memoir, I ended up starting out with the time that Angela and I translated the letters, and how it came to be that I ended up making a whole historical novel out of that. And the many cross-cultural exchanges that occurred because of that. Things I did in the US to explore the history of Cleveland, things I did in Germany to explore the history of the Rhineland-Palatinate. And I tell that all in this memoir, How We Survive Here. The first half of the book is that story, and the second half is a complete translation of the letters and an index of the surnames. So when you are writing your stories, here are some things to remember. Write often. Maybe set a time for yourself, 10 minutes. 10 minutes every day. That is so much better than 1 hour, one time a week. If you wait for 1 hour, one time a week, you're going to spend the first half hour trying to remember where you left off. It's much less efficient. So just a couple minutes every day, and you'll be surprised how much progress you make. In my genealogy writing group, we have a thing of 5 pages every 2 weeks. And with 5 pages every 2 weeks, that's how my memoir, How We Survive Here, was written. It gets done. It's really amazing. Write it little by little. Don't try to tackle it all at once. Just a little bit at a time. You know, the format and what it will become is a process of evolution, and you will find it as you go along. So you don't have to know everything at the beginning. A writing group, in my opinion, is essential. I hope that you have a way in your community or in a special interest group or something to form a writing group, because having other eyes look at something and ask you questions is just invaluable. Now, when you're writing a story, and you're relying on memory, memory can be faulty, and sometimes we have speculation about things that we don't really know for sure. And I think it's wonderful to tell those things that you speculate about, but it's also important to make sure the reader knows that you are speculating, that this isn't fact. So you can use introductory things like maybe, or I imagine, or the way I heard the story, or things to clarify for the reader that this is your take on it. And relax. Storytelling is fun. So there are many benefits to storytelling. Our brains are more active when we tell stories. If you do have a writing practice every day, you will learn to communicate with more clarity. You'll eliminate stress. You'll be more productive. You'll learn more. You'll gain a deeper awareness of your own reality. You'll make better decisions. You will be happier. I found all of these things on this website, facilethings.com, the benefits of writing. So, and also in Sharon Lippencott's Writing for the Health of It, she says that it benefits us physically too. Lowered blood pressure, increased immune and cardiovascular function, relief of asthma, arthritis pain, an increased sense of happiness. So I want to leave you with this thought. This is my great-great-grandfather, Michael Harm, in 1870, who apprenticed to be a blacksmith. Who do you think he ever imagined that 5 generations later, his great-great-granddaughter would come along and not only get invested in his life, but also take some blacksmithing classes and try to learn part of what his trade was all about, and even write a historical novel based on his life. I guess the point of my story is you just never know. It's just such an adventure to write, and I encourage you all to do it. Again, if and family stories endure as long as we keep telling them. So, and it keeps the traditions alive. So that is the conclusion of my talk. Again, my name, clairegebben@gmail.com, if you want to email for a handout or questions. And my website is clairegebben.com. So I hope you enjoyed our time together. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful festival safely at home.